Look up at almost any plane in the sky, every commercial airliner, every modern fighter, every passenger jet that has carried you across an ocean. They all fly on an engine that was conceived in a Royal Air Force cadet's college thesis when he was 21, patented at 22, then dismissed by his own government as a fantasy for 9 years. By the time the British finally believed him, another country had built the same engine first. Some people change the world, and the world never learns their name. This is without whom. His name was Frank Whittle. He was born in Coventry, England, in the spring of 1907. His father was a working mechanic who ran a small valve and piston ring shop in the English Midlands. There was no money, and there were no connections, and from the moment Frank could read, he wanted to fly. As a small boy in his father's noisy workshop, he taught himself how engines worked by taking them apart. He read every aviation magazine he could borrow from the library. He built model airplanes from wood and tin plate and watched them rise against the chimney smoke of industrial England. He told anyone who would listen that one day he would build engines for the Royal Air Force. When Frank was 15, he walked into a recruiting office and applied to be an apprentice in the Royal Air Force. The medical officer measured him and turned him away. He was 5 feet tall and small for his age. He went home, drew up a personal regimen of exercise and a careful diet, grew 3 inches in a year, and tried again. They turned him away again. On a third attempt, under a slightly different name, he was finally accepted. 3 years later, the Royal Air Force did something it had never done with him before. It noticed him. Out of hundreds of apprentices in his cohort, a handful were chosen to attend the new Royal Air Force College at Cranwell as officer cadets. The mechanic's son from the Midlands was one of them. For the first time in his life, Frank Whittle was in a room full of clever men, and he was the cleverest one in it. In his final year at Cranwell, in 1928, he wrote a thesis. He was 21. The paper was called Future Developments in Aircraft Design. He argued mathematically that the propeller had a ceiling. No aircraft could ever fly faster than about 500 miles an hour using one. He proposed something else, a continuous jet of burning gas forced backward through a nozzle, driving the aircraft forward. On the 16th of January, 1930, Frank Whittle, by then a junior pilot officer of 22, filed patent number 347-206, improvements relating to the propulsion of aircraft. He had no laboratory, no funding, and no senior engineer behind him. He had drawn the world's first turbojet engine in detail on his own. The patent itself is still on public record today. He sent his patent and his thesis to the Air Ministry. The reply came back politely worded and absolutely dismissive. There were no metals, the senior engineers wrote, that could withstand the temperatures he described. The combustion chamber would melt. The turbine blades would shatter. The ministry took the patent for the public record and did nothing else. For 5 years, he watched his patent sit unread on a Whitehall shelf. In 1935, when the patent came up for its annual renewal fee, the Air Ministry refused to pay it. Whittle himself, on a junior officer's salary with a wife and 2 small sons, could not afford the few pounds it cost. The patent lapsed into the public domain. 2 former Royal Air Force colleagues had become businessmen in London. In 1936, they came to him with an idea. They would form a small private company with their savings, and they would build his engine themselves. They called it Power Jets Ltd. Whittle was still a serving officer in the Royal Air Force, and they let him moonlight on the side, designing a turbojet. Power jets had no proper laboratory. Whittle rented a corner of an electrical workshop in Rugby. He worked there at night, after his Royal Air Force day, then drove back to base before dawn to teach the next class of pilots. He could not sleep. He lost weight, then more weight. He took cigarettes and stimulants to stay awake. He developed stomach ulcers and eczema on his hands. On the 12th of April, 1937, the engine was ready. Frank Whittle stood beside it in the rented Rugby workshop, his hands shaking, and gave the order to start. The engine lit, and then, with a rising shriek, it began to run away. The throttle was wide open and it kept accelerating. The other engineers ran out of the room. Whittle stayed alone and watched his life's work either become the first jet engine in history or kill him. It did not kill him. It ran itself out and stopped. He had a working turbojet. He was, at that moment, ahead of everyone in the world by years. What he did not know was that across the North Sea in Germany, an engineer named Hans von Ohain was being given exactly the funding, the materials, and the engineering support that the British Air Ministry had refused to give Frank Whittle. On the 27th of August, 1939, a small experimental jet called the Heinkel 178 took off from a field in northern Germany. It was the first jet-powered aircraft to fly anywhere in the world. 5 days later, German tanks rolled into Poland and the Second World War began. Frank Whittle, reading the news, knew he had been right. He had been first, and his own country had lost the race because it would not believe him. Now, with a world war beginning, the Air Ministry suddenly cared about jet engines. Money was poured into power jets. Engineers and a proper test facility appeared. Frank Whittle, after 9 years carrying the project alone, broke. He could not eat. He could not work for more than a few hours at a time. He was hospitalized twice, and between hospital stays, he kept going. On the 15th of May, 1941, a small silver experimental aircraft sat at the end of a runway in Lincolnshire. There were no propellers. A test pilot named Jerry Sayer eased the throttle forward. The engine howled. The aircraft rolled, lifted, and climbed into the English sky. It flew for 17 minutes. When it landed, Frank Whittle was waiting at the edge of the runway. The engine on board was the one he had drawn at 21. In 1944, in the middle of the war, his engine would help win. The Air Ministry nationalized power jets without his consent. The original shareholders were paid a fraction of what the business was worth. Whittle himself received about £10,000. 4 years later, a royal commission awarded him another 100,000. It was nothing close to the value of what he had given the world. He was knighted in 1948 and retired from the Royal Air Force the same year, exhausted, ill, and bitter. He worked for the British National Airline and then for a major oil company. He moved permanently to America, became a research professor at the United States Naval Academy, married a second wife, and lived quietly in Maryland. Most of his neighbors had no idea who the polite English engineer next door had been. Every passenger plane in the sky today, every fighter jet in the world, every long-haul flight that has ever taken a family across an ocean runs on the principle Frank Whittle drew at 21. A statue of him stands now in Coventry, the town where he was born. His original drawings still survive, and they look today almost exactly like the inside of a modern jet engine. He died on the 9th of August, 1996, in Maryland, at the age of 89. He had given his country the engine of the future, and his country had nearly missed it. The world you live in was built by people you have never heard of. And now, you know one more name: Frank Whittle. Like and subscribe and stick around, because the textbooks left a lot out. Thanks for watching.